Well, then, we're going to start things officially then. Want to thank you for attending the last of our presentations in this year's Student Scholar Series. The series was instituted, as you know, 14 years ago now, in order to recognize notable legal scholarship produced by members of the student body during the previous academic year, and to foster the skills associated with presenting and defending that scholarship in a professional conference style setting. Today's presentation will be made by third-year law student Kerry O'Donnell. Before I introduce Kerry, a few words about her distinguished respondent, Peter Torin. Mr. Torin is an intellectual property litigator, helps individuals and companies protect their IP rights, and also, because of his background as a federal prosecutor with the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property of the U.S. Department of Justice, has extensive experience in federal criminal law. He has tried dozens of cases in his career, has argued numerous times before the Second, Fifth, Ninth, and federal circuits. He was a partner with Sidley Austin in New York City from 1998 to 2009. He is the author of the leading treatise on criminal violations of intellectual property rights and computer crime, entitled Intellectual Property and Computer Crime from Full Court Press, published in 2003, first published then, and co-author of Defend Trade Secrets Act of 2016 Handbook from Walters Kluwer. In 2014, National Law Journal named him the top 50, among the top 50 intellectual property trailblazers and pioneers. He has published numerous articles that appeared in a variety of publications and is a frequent contributor to the press and has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Forbes, CNN, Bloomberg TV, and The Guardian. He's also a frequent blogger on IP issues on his website, www.petertorin.com. I told him I had to edit this down because I could have gone on, and that's the level of the distinction that he brings to Kerry's presentation today. We thank him for being with us. Now, Kerry O'Donnell is a third-year law student here at Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. She will graduate this May with a certificate from the Law and Technology Institute, Intellectual Property track. She attended Columbia University in New York City for her undergraduate degree, and she studied pre-med neuroscience with an emphasis on psychology, wrote her thesis on the neurobiology of addiction, specifically comparing the efficacy of different countries' approaches to treatment. Kerry's background in math and science is what led to her interest in the regulatory framework surrounding the treatment of opioid use disorder, especially as new opportunities in virtual medicine came to the fore during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll now turn the floor over to the last of this year's Student Scholars Series winners, Kerry O'Donnell. The title of her presentation, In Favor of Deregulating Medication-Assisted Treatment for the Telemedical Treatment of Opioid Use Disorder. Kerry.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen here. Here we go. All right, thank you so much, Professor Harmon. Going to start out here just posing some questions that I had at the outset that sort of guided my comment. One, how can the law better help opioid addicts recover? How can the law advance addiction science? How can the law increase access to life-saving treatment for opioid addiction? How can the law facilitate increased access to the medicine proven to give opioid addicts the best chance at recovery? Why hasn't the United States sought to overhaul the overregulation of medicine that is, quote, the gold standard for treating individuals with opioid use disorder? Why are the federal laws more restrictive when medications are used to treat addiction? And finally, how did the United States find itself in such a grave situation, and what can we do to change course? So I'm going to give you a brief overview, sort of an exploration of the opioid crisis in order to ultimately argue for the deregulation of medication-assisted treatment and the increased access to buprenorphine through virtual health platforms. I understand that's a lot of science words, so we're going to go through and explain them real quick. So what is medication-assisted treatment? It's the physician-preferred course of treatment that is the use of medications in combination with counseling and behavioral therapy, and it has emerged as the most efficient treatment for OUD. Because it is so likely for an opioid addict to return to drug use directly after detoxification, an important way to support sustainable recovery from OUD, opioid use disorder, is to use medications that reduce the negative effects of withdrawal and cravings without producing the euphoria that the opioid addiction caused. So it provides a whole patient approach. The goal is full recovery, including the ability to live a self-directed life. And MAT improves patient survival and treatment retention. So why now? Real-time data suggests that COVID-19 has affected OUD death rates. The collision of the pandemic and the existing OUD epidemic has heightened stress-related factors that fuel OUD, even perpetuating new cases in opioid misuse. Telemedicine and virtual health, which have emerged right alongside an increase in OUD, provide an opportunity to address the issue. The gradually atrophying role of in-person care likewise affects the legal framework, especially with MAT and OUD. It is at this intersection between telemedicine and the opioid crisis that a space for legal reform emerges. So roadmap, and this sort of mirrors my comment. I'm going to give you a little more background. We're going to talk about the federal players. There's tons of agencies involved here. We're going to look at prior law. Again, so many laws involved here. That's part of the problem, right? Overregulation. We're going to look at what the experts, the medical experts, have to say about this. We're going to analyze some potential problems and counter arguments to what I'm advocating for here. And then we will conclude with some Q&A with Peter. So here's some background, the waves of the rise in opioid overdose deaths, some statistics to start us off. Every day, 128 Americans die from opioid use disorder. 83,000 drug overdose deaths from June 2019 to 2020 can be attributed to opioid use disorder. More than 760,000 people have died since 1999 from drug overdoses, and 2 out of 3 of these in 2018 involved an opioid. McKinsey and Company estimate that the, quote, nationwide prevalence of substance abuse and mental health administration could be upwards to 4 million people, significantly higher than government estimates. And only 25% of those currently suffering from substance abuse and dependence receive the treatment they need. So moving into this societal cost, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's huge. I mean, this is this is at the fore of this topic. So the Center for Disease Control estimates that misuse costs the United States $78.5 billion yearly. And the economic burden rises as the cases rise, and this is especially evident through state Medicaid. Finally, the crisis is undiscerning. The National Vital Statistics System has identified a varied racial and ethnic swath of opioid overdose deaths. Racial, ethnic, and age-related factors cannot be said to lead to OUD deaths. A study showed that from 2015 to 2017, nearly all racial, ethnic groups and age groups experienced increases in opioid-involved overdose death rates. Similarly, they affect both urban and rural communities, men and women of all socioeconomic classes. The science. So, that's a little blurry, but this is how I can pare this down for a law audience. This is how opioids impact the brain. So the opioid receptors are the lock, and the opioids are the key that turn the receptor on, resulting in intoxication or euphoria. The medication that I'm advocating for, the medication used for MAT, it fills the opioid receptors to help prevent opioid misuse and withdrawal symptoms. In other words, by using MAT, the individual does not have the same intoxicating effects or euphoria, which results in encouraging recovery. A little more science. The medications work by tricking the brain into thinking it's receiving the abused drug. As I mentioned, there's no euphoria, and they are initially used as well to prevent withdrawal, which is obviously the first few days when an opioid addict is going off of their drug of choice. Withdrawal is a huge factor in whether or not they retain treatment or recovery. So a quick word on the Controlled Substances Act before we explore other federal regulations. It's the statute establishing federal U.S. drug policy under which the manufacture, importation, possession, use, and distribution of certain substances is regulated through a series of schedules, which you can see here. In theory, the DEA implements and enforces the CSA to, quote, establish a unified legal framework to regulate certain drugs that have been designated for control by Congress or through admin proceedings. The policy behind the CSA is to both prevent public health crises through unfettered access to dangerous drugs while also allowing eligible patients to receive their necessary medications for legitimate purposes. I will argue that unfortunately the CSA falls short in both of these aims. And I will point out as well that opioids are Schedule II, and the medication I will be advocating for in the medication-assisted treatment is buprenorphine, and you can find that in Schedule III. Okay, so why buprenorphine? And I will flip back to this slide here. There are 3 medications that are at the forefront of medication-assisted treatment. Those are methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. So I'm going to tell you why buprenorphine. So first of all, methadone, it suppresses cravings. It's an FDA-approved opioid agonist. It's a synthetic drug used to treat opioid addiction. However, it requires in-person administration from a practitioner in a clinic and must be dispensed through specialized programs, which of course are severely regulated. Because it requires in-person administration from a practitioner in a clinic and can cause severe adverse side effects, including respiratory depression, it's not ideal for what I'm advocating for here, for mass telemedical medication-assisted treatment. So while it's widely used for the treatment of OUD, and actually was, when I wrote my paper in undergrad, was actually the leading treatment for OUD, it can be easily abused, leading to psychological and physiological dependence, an effect that would further devastate and compound the opioid crisis. Moving to naltrexone, it blocks the euphoric effects of opioids. It's a full antagonist. It displaces the opioids from opioid receptors and reverses the sought after high effect. It was approved by the FDA in 1984. Injectable naltrexone was approved in 2010 for preventing return to opioid dependence after medically supervised withdrawal, but it requires that patients be opioid abstinent for a time after withdrawal before beginning the medication treatment. And as I mentioned, that's sort of a critical period for relapse. Because of the required detoxification period before beginning the MAT treatment, naltrexone has been associated with low adherence and a high level of relapse back to opioids after discontinuation. It's not widely used. It's because of the low rates of patient acceptance, difficulty in achieving abstinence, and high rates of medication non-adherence. Its worst effect is that as it reduces the tolerance to opioids, combining that with a patient's likelihood for relapse in the initial detoxification period, it could easily lead to death, respiratory arrest, circulatory collapse, for patients returning to their previously thought dose of opioid that got them high before. So buprenorphine, it's the first medication to treat OUD that can be prescribed or dispensed in physician offices. So it significantly increases access to treatment. It can be prescribed and dispensed in settings beyond those of where methadone and naltrexone can be distributed. The FDA's approval of buprenorphine in distribution in primary care offices eliminates the need for opioid treatment programs and immediately expands MAT accessibility for OUD. The drug offers several benefits to those with OUD and to others for whom treatment in a methadone clinic is not appropriate or is less convenient. So buprenorphine generally is more convenient. The Schedule II controlled substance accessibility and administration problems surrounding the other 2 drugs I just mentioned, methadone and naltrexone, they don't exist here because the FDA's approval of buprenorphine eliminates the need and expands accessibility for this Schedule III drug. I know that's a lot of information, but I gotta tell you about the science first. All right, the federal players. So various governmental agencies have different roles in the opioid crisis. As I mentioned at the outset, there's all sorts of guidelines for prescribing and controlling the regulatory efforts. So while providing useful reports, the agencies often generate impractical plans of action, or at least ones that are hard to implement. Of course, I'm not an expert on that, but this is just my opinion. So for the DEA, they have enforcement power when it comes to controlled substance laws and regulations, limiting the number of certain medications and drugs and who has access to them. So the CSA, again. They investigate and prosecute violations of controlled substance law and monitor specific drugs through designations of Schedules 1 through 5, which again, you saw here. It liaises with state, national, and international organizations on matters relating to the control of drugs. They have sort of this idealistic 360 strategy where they say they're responding to the opioid crisis through law enforcement, diversion, and community outreach. But you know, it's a lot of talk, basically. The challenges here include assessing the impact of community outreach and partnership efforts in funded cities to present actionable learnings for DEA decision makers. So it's a bit too far removed from the communities affected. The Department of Health and Human Services, their alleged 5 strategies include: 1, improving access to treatment and recovery; 2, promoting use of overdose reversing drugs; 3, strengthening our understanding of the epidemic through better public health surveillance; 4, providing support for cutting-edge research on pain and addiction; and 5, advancing better practice for pain management. Most useful in my recommendation here is the HHS's plan for anti-stigmatization of the addict. So the HHS, sorry for all the acronyms, in connection with the Office for Civil Rights, seeks to protect OUD patients from discrimination. They emphasize that, quote, Americans who are successfully receiving long-term treatment for OUD can lead normal lives. The FDA, through its 2018 strategic policy roadmap, aims to address several facets of the opioid crisis, including: 1, decreasing exposure and preventing new addiction; 2, increasing support treatment of those with OUD; 3, fostering development of novel pain treatment; 4, improving enforcement and assessing the benefit risk framework for drug approval and removal. They actually have a designated opioid policy steering committee, which was established in May 2017 to prioritize exploring strategies to combat the opioid crisis. So they've been able to research and promulgate a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, but they haven't really been able, there's no concrete plan of action in terms of mitigating OUD effects. The Department of Justice, through its consumer protection branch's, quote, opioid enforcement effort, states that they're, quote, committed to using every available tool to prevent overdose deaths and hold accountable those responsible for the opioid crisis. We're all familiar with the ongoing litigation, attacking the problem through criminal and civil actions. So that falls in the realm of the DOJ. So the Center for Disease Control, their role is one of education, prevention, and outreach to physicians and the public alike to promote safety without specifically engaging in legislation. And perhaps most usefully in the Center for Disease Control, they have a sub-department that is called Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services. I'll refer to it as SAMHSA. It's heavily involved in substance abuse legislation. So the agency's core principle of, quote, increasing access to the full continuum of services for mental and substance use disorders is directly in line for what I'm advocating, suggesting that perhaps the Department of Health and Human Services through SAMHSA is directly in line with what I'm suggesting. They can be most immediately involved in advocating for deregulation and promulgating rules that allow increased access to telemedical medication-assisted treatment. All of this to say that the federal players haven't really figured this one out, which again, that's a gross generalization, but everyone has a plan. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and that is amplified by all of these laws. I will say maybe a sentence or two on each for the purpose of time here. So we touched on the Controlled Substance Act, the CSA. In terms of the Narcotic Addict Treatment Act, it amended the CSA to provide for the registration of practitioners conducting narcotic treatment programs. And it largely did this by defining important and emerging terms in addiction science, like, quote, maintenance treatment, which MAT is, and, quote, detoxification treatment. So the Drug Addiction Treatment Act, DATA, allowed for certain qualified doctors to obtain a waiver from the certification requirements of opioid treatment programs to treat OUD with FDA-approved Schedule III drugs, such as buprenorphine, what I'm advocating for here. The act intended to take addiction specialists only OUD treatment back to the addict's primary care provider, I think in a very good way. So DATA, this law, while lessening some restrictions surrounding accessibility to MAT, it still added extra, albeit relatively lesser, red tape hurdles for the primary care physicians. So in 2007, SAMHSA, who's in charge of sort of distributing the federal guidelines for OUD medication treatment, they implemented, I think, 4 elements that each registration and certified health provider had to meet. Must be certified and accredited, licensed by the state in which they operate, registered with the DEA, other requirements through state and local governments. So again, lots of problems there in terms of finding regulation and who has the authority. The 2008 Ryan Haidt Online Pharmacy Consumer Protection Act was implemented in order to monitor and regulate prescriptions obtained through the internet. And this came into being because Ryan Haidt, he ordered Vicodin online, and while without having seen a doctor or verifying a medical necessity. And because of this, Congress sought to enact a law that would verify the legitimacy of internet pharmacies and their prescriptions. So this actually is a huge obstacle in the way of what I'm advocating for here. Even though Vicodin is a Schedule II drug and what I'm suggesting is a Schedule III, the Ryan Haidt Online Pharmacy Act doesn't really differentiate between the two. I sort of touched on the federal guidelines for opioid treatment programs. The CARA Act in 2016 was the first major addiction bill since the CSA of 1970. It was enacted to address the opioid epidemic, overdose deaths and lack of access to life-saving treatment. Finally, the substance use, this is a long one. I'm going to go ahead and call it the Support Act, which is what it's referred to in legislation, was passed in October 2018 to address the opioid epidemic specifically through Medicaid's role. So this was, in my opinion, this was quite admirable. It nixed the prohibition of Medicaid funds for substance use disorder. All of this to say there's lots of agencies and lots of laws that affect regulation here. It's very tough to navigate. So it isn't working. What is working, or what was working, is the COVID-19 emergency guidelines. Unfortunately, we've since defaulted back to stricter guidelines, but when I wrote the comment, these were in place. So in March of 2020, the DEA and SAMHSA began to make exceptions for the telemedical provision of buprenorphine, acknowledging that, quote, drug overdose prevention remains critical during the pandemic. So OTP guidance was being updated and expanded to provide increased flexibility, even allowing for, quote, blanket exceptions for all stable patients in OTP to receive 28 days of take-home doses of the patient's medication. The HHS temporarily waived the Ryan Heights Act requirement for the in-person evaluation, which is, of course, a huge hurdle for what I'm advocating for here. And the DEA used its enforcement discretion to authorize telephone consultation. So these results, they were overwhelmingly positive. It shows that these agencies can work together and sort of lessen the restrictions on medication-assisted treatment. When the buprenorphine prescribers transitioned to providing telemedicine visits in high volume, they were able to target OUD sufferers in both rural and urban settings, so accessibility went up. I'm going to go ahead and skip this, but you can I'll give you a second to read just in the interest of time. Basically more evidence that what I'm recommending will work because we've seen it work at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, what the experts say. So in a nutshell, the medical experts agree with what I'm recommending. This US Surgeon General echoes my recommendation, stating that, quote, studies have repeatedly demonstrated the efficacy of MAT at reducing illicit drug use and overdose deaths, improving retention and treatment, and even, and this is something I found especially interesting, reducing HIV transmission. The Surgeon General also comments on the evidence of prisoners with OUD show that those receiving the medication-assisted treatments are more likely to remain sober after prison. Psychologists note the role of shame in opioid addiction, that is a barrier to treatment, but I would argue that the telemedical TMAT is a way to get around that. Virtual health options could alleviate the often lethal ramifications of sort of the psychological and physical shame barrier. Okay, so potential concerns to increasing medication-assisted treatment accessibility. So there's an issue of sort of bottleneck, the availability of providers, supply demand. Certain people who do not advocate for deregulating have said that there's not enough practitioners, there'd be ethical considerations of who gets the help first. I believe that a graver concern in this sort of doctor supply patient demand chain is the issue of constraints on each practitioner's number of patients. That's what I would advocate increasing. Whereas now I believe it's 35, you could treat 35 OUD patients in a year. And if you meet a bunch of requirements, you can increase that to 100 in the second year. Stigmatization, we've talked about at length. Because of stigmatization relating irrational fears surrounding MAT, those suffering from OUD, as seen in this sort of wheel here, may not seek treatment, even with a deregulated framework. So that's a pretty big concern. Counter arguments to what I'm proposing, drug diversion, of course, and that involves the transfer of any legally prescribed controlled substance from the individual for whom it is prescribed to another person for any illicit use. So the DOJ, the good news is the DOJ, the DEA, and Diversion Control Division's mission is to counterbalance this. I would advocate that they determine the illicit uses of buprenorphine, they're minimal, which is important, and enforce the diversion laws accordingly. It seems to me pretty clear cut that there's an agency in place to take care of drug diversion. Here you can see a graphic for challenging the myths about MAT. So that speaks to replacement, addiction, confused morality concerns. Finally, I'll talk about the scope. the opioid crisis and treatment, they don't occur in a vacuum. And I've spoken to that here at length. There are many variables, not the least of which is to attend to the totality of an addict's circumstances when evaluating treatment models and their efficacy. So these agencies have identified major dimensions that support recovery, physical health, a stable home, meaningful daily purpose, and community support. Nothing in this comments recommendation serves to overshadow what will likely need to be the eventual complete overhaul of the opioid treatment scheme as it stands now. So my recommendation, I think Congress's incremental improvements towards MAT deregulation, I think they should be instated long-term. I think the COVID-19 emergency guidelines should be instated long-term. Patients and caregivers noted positive impacts of telemedicine, including greater access and convenience, further highlighting that these flexible guidelines are a step in the right direction. Opening up TMAT is in line with what all the medical experts have said in terms of streamlining addiction treatment. Many treatment providers across the US have said publicly that the new status quo of flexible guidelines, so again, I wrote this and I turned this in last spring, so that was the flexible guidelines were what they were using at the time, that they represent long sought change that could positively transform patient care for decades to come. So, and this is kind of, again, very general, but I believe that the DEA, SAMHSA, and other agencies should expand the pathways to TMAT and make it available to everyone through deregulating the current opioid regulations. That is all. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Thank you, Kerry. I think it's time now to turn things over to Peter Torn. Peter, if you would conduct the response.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you, Kerry, for that very detailed and informative presentation. Just have some general questions for you. You've made a very persuasive case that this area needs to be changed, deregulated. Where do you see that the greatest obstacle is to deregulate this area? I guess the legal regulatory system has to be changed, but where do you see it as the greatest obstacle to overcome some of the barriers that you may have mentioned?
Well, I think, and this is sort of off the cuff here, but I think the increase in fentanyl deaths recently will make those who do not understand addiction more likely to stigmatize the treatment with medication-assisted treatment. So I think actually those deaths could counterintuitively delay, regulatory frameworks opening up for increased MAT. And I also think that under the CSA, again, the 1970 Act, I don't think buprenorphine should be a Schedule III drug. Removing that could provide immediate impact in, many of these regulations. I think that needs to be re-explored.
And who would be responsible for reclassifying buprenorphine? That would be the DEA?
Correct.
Okay. Do you know if there's been any consideration? I know this is past your deadline of your paper, but do you know if there's since the TMAT and since the COVID crisis, do you know if the DEA has considered at all reclassifying buprenorphine?
I do not know at the time. I'm not aware of them moving in this direction. It's a pretty drastic step. I realize a lot of what I'm suggesting is pretty idealistic. It is a drastic step, but it is something I hope to see in my lifetime.
Okay. Do you know what the current policy of the DEA is since your comment?
Yeah, so we're back to stricter regulations, unfortunately. In order to become a buprenorphine waived practitioner, you have to jump through a bunch of hoops, notify various actors at SAMHSA, at HHS, You must be admitted and approved to a group showing your notification of intent to distribute MAT. The good news is that the system now does allow for an increase in qualified practitioners to deliver MAT, because they now allow nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, clinical nurse specialists, certified registered nurses. They're allowed to act as qualified practitioners and able to undertake the training to dispense with MAT treatment.
Okay. You mentioned in your paper, especially, that there's been extensive fraud in connection with the various programs, both TMAT and MAT. Who is the federal agency that is, or the federal entity, I should say, that is responsible for overseeing? And do you think they're doing a good job based on your review of the record?
It's the Department of Justice. Right now, they're bringing criminal charges against people who have diverted and fraudulently sought insurance for TMATs. I think healthcare fraud schemes have resulted in like 104 billion alleged losses during the pandemic. So that's definitely a huge concern. I would say that there's a specific entity there to deal directly with that problem, and I don't necessarily think it should affect a policy change.
Okay. I know there's been quite a bit of press recently about the opioid litigation, and based on your litigation and the crisis, and based on all the work you've done researching this paper, do you have any general thoughts about what's going on in this area?
I think this is tough, right? We all have pretty intense opinions about this. I think it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this place. I do believe that there were regulatory failures by the FDA leading up to the crisis. I think a lot of us can agree on that. The classification of oxycodone, it wasn't, the FDA did not research enough the capacity for these to become, gateways to severe addiction to opiates. I don't know. I think there's regulatory failures on both sides. I don't know that I can speak to sort of the families involved in the opioid litigation. I'm glad to see that it's happening, that they're being held accountable. And at the same time, I think that's kind of sort of existing up in the clouds and not really addressing the problem on the ground.
If people who are listening to this agree with your recommendation and your analysis, do you think there's something people can do to get the government to implement some of your recommendations and take what sounds like a very wise approach to a serious problem? Where do you think the change has to come from?
So I think it has to start with policy in the legislature. I don't know that any of us I'm sure there's to-dos I could give each of you, but I think, it really has to start with addressing the stigma of addiction and medication-assisted treatment. Congress needs to amplify their voices on that. They need to emphasize that MAT treatment for OUD is its evidence-based therapy, that addiction is a disease, and this is the best evidence-based way to address the opioid crisis. So I think we need policy reform there.
Okay, and that would start with the federal government. Is there any role for states to be involved, do you think, in this?
Of course.
What do you think the role of states versus the federal government is?
Well, ultimately, I think the federal government needs to promulgate rules that apply to all the states, given that, when I'm speaking about the regulatory framework and sort of the legal red tape, there's too many cooks in the kitchen right now. There's increased regulations in some states, decreased in others. So I honestly do think it needs to start at the top and sort of trickle down from there. So
kind of write your congressman, so to speak.
I suppose.
I think my last question, do you think that TMAT and MAT can help reduce the stigma towards substance abuse and towards, especially towards opioid abuse? And in what way do you think that can work? And if that's true, in what way do you think that may help?
I think reducing the stigma of the addict, the opioid addict, I think that's huge. And I think that's really a starting point for this entire debate and recommendation. That's incredibly integral in terms of how the law can help reduce the stigma towards the addict, and Matt specifically, honestly, through education. I don't have like specific plans of action in that sense.
Mm-hmm. But it's focused on educating and educating the public.
Yes, I think there's so many misconceptions about addiction. It's quite sad, actually.
Well, I think that those are, at least for right now, my questions. So Professor, I'd like to open up the floor and see if people who are listening in have any further questions for Kerry.
Sounds good. Kerry, let me ask you one quick question before we go on. Is there a prophylactic use for this drug? Is that something that it can do? It seems like to me it cuts off you said the euphoric dimension to things.
Right.
If opioids are continuing to be prescribed, I mean, can it, instead of as a reaction to an addiction, as a way to cut off the addiction from ever starting, is that part of this at all? Or could it be part of the solution?
I'm more focused on those who are deep in the throes of opioid addiction at the moment. I sort of studied the framework about, how the existing medications could help in a way that they aren't being utilized right now. In terms of the pharmacological implications of your question, I have no idea. I think that's a steep question that would involve a lot of research.
I just wondered, because it seems to me prescription is to cut off the euphoria, and I suppose that's a very complex question, but I just wondered about it.
Well, your question presumes that the addict, before they take the drug, doesn't want the euphoria, right? I think there's a lot of assumptions of what you're asking. I think the addict is seeking the euphoria, and that's the problem. I don't think the addict knows that they're going to become an addict.
That's it. Yeah. Ms. Babb, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. Kerry, what a wonderful presentation. You did such great research. And I have a couple of questions following on Mr. Torrens' question. Is there a role for judicial education and the education of attorneys about substance use disorders and medically assisted treatment?
Absolutely. In law school, I've clerked for various family attorneys, and I've been in CASA, a court-appointed special advocate for children. And actually, especially through that, I learned how important it is to sort of look at the full picture of the addict when considering how to address the problem from the law's perspective. I was in the Families and Law Clinic, and in terms of sort of, meeting the client where they're at, I think it definitely involves a level of education and, and empathy, frankly, that all attorneys could seek.
And my follow-up question, if I may, is whether in your research you've come across any models, either nationally or internationally, that you feel, and maybe you haven't done this part of it, which is that you feel would be really relevant for states and the United States as a whole to adopt.
So internationally, I did not look there because I'm more concerned with, the immediate regulatory framework. There has been indication in a study in Pennsylvania that this is a working model. I'm sure more and more, localities that try to adopt this type of approach to OUD will honestly find the same. But yeah, there have been a couple case studies that show this works.
And that all of the literature surrounding drug treatment courts is also really relevant to this, because most drug treatment courts are moving in this direction as well, with this, it's not just buprenorphine, it's buprenorphine plus the counseling. It's the whole, as you say, the whole holistic approach, which is admirable and something that we're seeking to implement. So good for you. Thank you. Thank you for the.
Anyone else have a question for Kerry? Scanning down here. It's Bab, you're done. Your hand's still up. I just want to make sure it's okay. Kerry, can you tell us something about how prescribed, Sarah, I'll defer to you. Professor Duggan.
I think you're muted, Professor Duggan.
There you go. I really don't have a question because it's a lot to take in just to respond, but I can say as somebody who really was involved just seeing the start of this back when I was a hospital or health system general counsel, that you've covered so much and covered so much about what needs to be done. You also have terrific slides. I think the visual is a means of communication that we too seldom think about. But I really want to just say great job and thank you. And I really learned a lot today and I'm still processing it, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Duggan.
As did I. And my question was could you both maybe fill us in? I mean, how since this has turned into such a problem, how prescribed is, let's say, fentanyl now? Is it as prescribed as it ever was, considering its dangers? I mean, people prescribed it, I think, initially because people were in such great pain and they were prescribed it for the pain. And then, of course, it started to be taken for more than just pain and that type of thing. But is that in any way affected the use of prescription of fentanyl as a painkiller, or is it as big as it ever was?
So, Professor Harmon with the meta questions, but I will say I think most fentanyl use today is a product of drug diversion. And I also don't think people who are seeking a euphoric high necessarily go to straight fentanyl. I think it is combined with other substances. People don't know it's there, and that's why there's a high death toll. But I don't know. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that particular point, Professor, that there's the very unfortunate story in the past week or 10 days about 4 or 5 West Point cadets who were on their spring break in Florida and thought that they were buying cocaine and using cocaine. And it turned out that the cocaine was laced and cut with fentanyl, and 4 of them ended up in the hospital, and 2 of them, I don't know what their status is, but they were in critical condition. And just to illustrate how strong fentanyl is as a drug, 2 of the cadets, there were 6 or 8 of them there, and 2 of them provided mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to the ones that used the cocaine and cut with the fentanyl. And the fentanyl was so strong that the cadets who provided the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation had to be taken to the hospital just on their exposure to the fentanyl as really a secondary source. So it's still, I think Kerry's right that a lot of it is diversion. Fentanyl, I believe, still has some valid legal uses, but I think a lot of it really is drug diversion. But it's an incredibly powerful drug that many people, unfortunately, have gotten very sick and died from.
Any other questions from anyone? I saw a couple of remarks in the chat. A lot of applause here for the presentation. I think really appreciate the depth in which you've gone into all of this for us and educated us on this. It is something that is, it's hard to get your head around. There's so much information and there's such a huge problem. But but to take it on at all is an achievement, and to your credit for doing so. I think we all would applaud Kerry here for a great presentation on it's something that's really I don't think we've ever had one like this before on this line, and it's certainly a worthy contribution to what we tried to do here. So Kerry, thank you for this. I know the video will be on our website, on our YouTube site. There'll be a story about this. We think all of us will encourage you to get this published and to enter it into the scholastic debate on the issue. So thank you to Peter Toren. Thank you to Kerry. Everyone's applauding you silently, and I'll do so audibly. And we will look forward to next year's presentation, starting again next spring. I guess this will be the 15th year we started. So a nice end to this year. Thank you to Kerry. Thank you to Peter. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.